folks, but Lee Strobel in particular, I'll focus on him. Lee Strobel in his books, The Case for Christ, The Case for a Creator, etc., pretends to be the skeptic reporter. And he runs around interviewing people, pretending to be the skeptic and exercising critical thought. I submit that Lee Strobel's critical thinking skills are grossly inadequate, and I also submit that he has yet to question people, and include them in his book, who disagree with him. He goes to people within the Discovery Institute, for example, or ministers or others, who agree with him, the point that he's trying to prove, and he asks them softball, weak-ass questions. And then he steals, by the way, you didn't have to use Lee Strobel. If you're going to start arguing from the Gospels, you might as well refer to Josh McDowell.
Yep.
I mean, that would have been at least slightly more reasonable, because while Strobel is a complete asshat who pretends to be a skeptic, McDowell actually tried to do some scholarly research. Unfortunately, he's not a scholar or an historian or anything along those lines, and so he managed to get all kinds of things wrong. And if you go to infidels.org and click on the library and do a search for evidence that demands a verdict, you'll find, I think from Jeffrey Lauder and several others, a chapter by chapter, a treatment of Josh McDowell's evidence that demands a verdict, that point out exactly where he got it wrong and why these claims. And I've heard your claims before, and Alan, I used to believe them, and I used to advocate for Lee Strobel, and I used to advocate for Josh McDowell as these champions of apologists, and they, by preaching to me as the choir, kept me convinced. And it wasn't until I actually bothered to investigate whether or not their claims were true. It wasn't until I investigated what objections critical thinkers, atheists, free thinkers, and people from other religions, if you want to find out what's wrong with your religion, go ask somebody in another one, had launched with regard to these apologetics. It is absurd in the highest degree to come, yes, I realize the Bible isn't a single book, it's a collection of writing. First of all, it's absurd to claim that it's consistent. It's not. I mean, if you can't look at the different characters of God at different times in both the Old and New Testament and realize that there's no consistency there, the consistency is in your mind. The fulfilled prophecy is in your mind. The believability is in your mind. You go into it predisposed wanting to believe it. Oh, look, there's all these documents. What documents? There's not a single contemporary historical document outside of the Bible regarding Jesus at all. There's nothing to confirm he lived, nothing to confirm any acts he did, nothing to confirm that he was killed, and certainly nothing to confirm he was resurrected. And yet when you listen to Lee Strobel, as I did in a video yesterday, where he listed his 5 E's, and I don't remember them all, but I did respond to them in an email, and I'll be happy to send them to you. One of his 5 E's that are supposed to be so convincing about Jesus is empty tomb. What? The tomb was empty. Okay. So the most logical conclusion from reports of an empty tomb is that some magical sky being rolled away the rock and resurrected his embodied self, and he went up. That's the most rational conclusion from that? I mean, what about, I mean, you guys gloss over all kinds of stuff. One thing Tracy had pointed out was this, you're reading along, and you're reading along in Matthew, and all of a sudden, and the bodies of the dead got up and walked around town, and then this happened. No, go back to that. You just talked about a whole bunch of zombies, and one verse. They're not contemporary accounts. They're not by eyewitnesses. No one is disputing that people have believed this. No one is disputing that there were Christians at the time. You can cite Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, it doesn't matter. None of them are saying Christians didn't exist, and I'm not saying that either. The question is whether or not the claims of Christians, whether or not the claims of the Bible are true. And a testimony, no matter how strongly it's believed, is not evidence of veracity. The truth of a matter is not determined by either how many people believe it or the strength of their belief, including whether or not they're willing to die for it, which is, I'm sure, one of the things that you'd eventually gotten to, because it's Strobel and McDowell's favorite. Would these apostles have willingly sacrificed their lives and been stoned rather than recant their beliefs? Sure. Are you saying that those people who have died for other religions make those religions true as well, even when they contradict your own? We're looking for evidence, not assertions, not anecdotes. There's an E for you, Strobel. Stay away from the A's. Give us E's. It's easy. I have no... Look, gravity. Yeah, it's maddening.
The other problem that I have is that even if you could demonstrate something that was not explainable, asserting that a God has caused it is meaningless because you don't know what a God is until you can examine it.
Yeah.
So if you have a if you're claiming a cause that you can't examine, and you're just looking at a result and saying, I don't know what this result is, so let's say a God did it, and I'm like, well, what is a God? Well,
Yeah.
I don't know because we can't examine one, so we don't even. It's just like saying X did it.
Yeah, let's explain a mystery with a mystery.
So even if you had like zombies walking around Austin, you would still have, and somebody said God did this, I'd still be like, well, what? I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, you need something.
What does that mean?
You've got to have some definition.
It's no better than saying X did it.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have a God to examine, if we don't have something to examine as the cause, then we're saying, you know, X did it.
It could be magical universe creating pixies. How is your understanding of God distinct from magical universe creating pixies, or magic man done it, whatever? How is your understanding of God distinct from that, and what is the evidence that supports that distinction?
That's what I'm saying. It's like whenever it gets to it, it's like when it gets down to it, when you go back, when you use the historicity, when you're using the logic, it finally is going to come down to a point where you have to say, well, how do we find out if this is right? You have to have something measurable, and if you don't, then you're talking about nothing. And if you've got nothing that you can measure, and that's what you're calling your cause, then you're labeling nothing God.
Yeah.
And saying nothing is God. And I don't even know what to make of that.
Yeah. On the historicity of Jesus, one of the big things from apologists is, well, we have more evidence for the existence of Jesus than X, Y, or Z. In most cases, they're just flat out wrong. They are wrong in both the quantity and nature of evidence. Caesar is probably their favorite thing, and yet we have things written in his own hand,
right.
And we have things written by opponents of his.
I'll usually take Socrates. Even though I think that Plato claims to have been to have known him personally,
right.
But I mean, I'll even sometimes give him that.
Oh, I'm fine. If you want to say Socrates, that's actually kind of in a way where I was going with this. I would grant that if Jesus were portrayed character-wise in the same vein as Socrates, I would say that we had decent evidence that this individual existed for all practical purposes, but whether he existed or not doesn't matter, in the same way that it doesn't matter whether Socrates existed or not. Whether he's a sock puppet of Plato's or a real person, there are words attributed to Socrates, and we can analyze them on their own merits to determine what their validity is.
It's the arguments that matter.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet, but in Jesus' case, even if we had rock-hard evidence that the individual existed, and I'm not asserting that he didn't, I'm just pointing out legitimate exceptions, that his existence is not evidence of the miraculous feats attributed to him at all, any more than any other supposed miracle man. There are men living today that we can go and interview who are reported to have performed miracles all over the world. Miracle men, and people who claim to live off prana and sunlight and not eat for 10 months. Oh, it just drives me nuts, the credulity of people who will buy into this. But Jesus' existence is, within Christianity, intrinsically tied to who he claimed to be, or who Christians portray him claiming to be. His miracles, the things that he did, his divinity. Whether or not I believe Socrates existed doesn't make any difference. Whether or not I believe Jesus existed does, from a Christian perspective. You can't separate the two. But anyway, I got on way too long.
Well,
yeah.